So on the surface, this story appears to be pretty cut and dry. In one corner, we have Jesus, starring in the familiar role of hero, defender of the weak, protector of the innocent, healer of our every ill. And in the other corner, we have the hypocritical, rules and regulations focused and all too easily maligned leader of the synagogue. I half expected Jesus to put on a cowboy hat and dramatically ride off into the sunset after this encounter. It's a scene that can be found repeatedly throughout the Gospels. Jesus sees someone who is hurting, someone who is in need of healing, and decides that the alleviation of their suffering is what matters most at that moment. He pays no mind to the fact that it's the Sabbath, no mind to all of the rules that he's breaking, and he does what he can to care for that person who is in need. And can you blame him? I mean, if you saw someone who was in pain and it was within your power to rectify the situation, wouldn't you do the same thing? And would any of us actually side with the leader of the synagogue on this one? Of course not. He is so clearly in the wrong that it's almost automatic how quickly we paint him as the villain. But like I said, that's how this story appears on the surface. Once we take a second to stick our heads in the water and check out what's happening below that surface, we find that there's actually a lot more going on here. We see that this story that once seemed so black and white is actually quite nuanced and complicated with far more gray areas than we thought. And it starts with the fact that the leader of the synagogue might not be the evil villain that we have made him out to be. Because you see, Jesus isn't breaking some random rule that was passed recently by the local city council. He was breaking biblical laws with divine origins. Whether you go back to the fact that God rested on the seventh and final day of creation, or the fourth commandment, which insists that we remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, or the numerous expansions of those concepts like we heard in this first reading for today that are throughout the Hebrew Bible that give practical, real-world examples of what should and shouldn't be done on that holy day, it's pretty clear that there is a great deal of precedence that Jesus is just ignoring. This isn't just any old law. It is a pillar upon which the Jewish faith rested. And besides the sacredness of the day, there were practical aspects to the rule as well. It served as protection for the Jewish people, that they never again would be worked to death as they had been when they were still held captive in the land of Egypt. So in a way, it functioned similarly to modern-day labor union rules. Now, I won't go so far as to say that means Jesus was crossing picket lines, but all of this does complicate the story just a little bit, don't you think? And it really put the leader of the synagogue in a tough situation. And what does he do? Does he commend Jesus for breaking the law to help this woman? Is one woman's well-being worth discarding a rule that was meant to protect and care for an entire nation? How would you respond? And although it all ends with the crowds rejoicing and cheering, I'm sure that there were a few tense moments of silence right after Jesus got called out. Awkward, furtive glances at one another, wondering, what he was going to say, how Jesus was going to justify his actions, because, the leader of the synagogue kind of had a point after all. As usual, though, Jesus does have a reason for why he did what he did, and it's a good one at that. There's the obvious one. It's Jesus, and healing is kind of his thing, and this woman is clearly in need. But more than that, I think that he intentionally chose to heal this woman on the Sabbath to call into question our tendency as people to blindly follow the rules. Instead, Jesus says that we should make sure that we pay attention not just to the letter of the law, but to the spirit of the law as well, to its original intent. In the Gospel of John, Jesus states that he came to earth so that we might have life and have it abundantly. And one could argue that the rule about observing the Sabbath was created with the same intent, that protecting a person's right to worship, protecting their right to rest once a week, that those things are essential to living abundantly. But in this particular instance, the rule was actually accomplishing just the opposite. It was depriving this woman of abundant life. It was putting stipulations on when and where she could get healed. Look, lady, I don't make the rules, I just enforce them, and the sign clearly says that healings are to take place on the first and third Mondays and the second and fourth Wednesdays in conjunction with the street sweeping schedule, and make sure to have your ID, your insurance card, and be prepared to pay your copay should your plan require it. It was putting stipulations on God's grace. And as we know, we have a God who time after time refuses to be boxed in, refuses to play life by our rules, a God who always tempers justice with mercy, a God who indiscriminately pours out grace and forgiveness and love for everyone, even the people we don't think deserve it. Actually, especially for the people we don't think deserve it. Now, I think it's important to point out that Jesus isn't, breaking laws willy-nilly here. He actually said previously that he came to fulfill the law, not abolish it. So, he's not promoting anarchy. He's not flaunting the rules because he's bored. He's doing so to remind us that from time to time we need to take a look at the rules that we're following and make sure that we understand the intent of those laws. And if a particular law is no longer serving its original purpose, or worse, if it is being abused, well, then it might be time to think about changing it. Henry David Thoreau would be quite proud of Jesus for this example of good old civil disobedience. It's a reminder that laws are meant to serve us, not the other way around, and that we shouldn't be shackled by laws that no longer serve their intended purpose, that we should always be reforming, always be assessing, never assuming that we got it right the first, second, or even third time, but always trying to figure out how we can best care for one another. Our denomination, the ELCA, just decided to do that at our church-wide assembly the other week. We passed a resolution to begin the process of reviewing our Constitution, a document that is only 35 years old, mind you, to make sure that it is still in line with our values, that it promotes the proclamation of the gospel, that it seeks to work for peace and justice, and helps us as a church to be welcoming and inclusive in all that we do. So was the leader of the synagogue just reluctantly doing his job when he quoted the law to Jesus? Maybe. Or maybe he really did enjoy it, this opportunity to flex his power. Or maybe he was scared of the new order that Jesus was bringing into being through his actions. And this was, his panicked attempt to regain control over the situation. Whatever the reason, we can see that this is far more than a simple healing story. It is a lesson in the relationship between law and grace, and what happens when stipulations are placed on the abundant life that we are all meant to have. Now, in addition to institutional rules, creating stipulations and barriers that prevent us from living lives of abundance, I think that we ourselves can inadvertently create them as well. As humans, we sometimes put conditions, or maybe I should say timelines, on our happiness, on our well-being. We have a tendency of pushing off our happiness, our ability to live life abundantly, to push it off somewhere down the road. And we end up making it conditional. I'll be happy when. I'll be happy when I finally get that raise, or I get hired for my dream job. I'll be happy when I finally find someone to spend my life with. I'll be happy when I lose the weight, or when I pass the test, or when I make it through this next season of life. And what happens is that the woman in today's story can become somewhat of a canvas upon which we paint and interpret our own stories. Because we all are afflicted by something. We all have something that we struggle with, some burden that we carry. It might be a physical ailment, like it was for the woman, or it might be invisible to the naked eye, an emotional or spiritual weight that prevents us from standing upright. And I think there can be this temptation to look at this story and say, if only Jesus would cure me of fill in the blank with whatever it is that you struggle with. If only he would cure me like he cured her, then I could truly begin to live my best life. Then I'd be happy and finally be able to flourish. When we look at this story and we sigh and we say, if only, what we end up doing is telling ourselves that the happiness and joy that she immediately felt, that fullness of life is out of our reach, that it's unattainable right now. And we forget Jesus' declaration to the leader of the synagogue that he has come to release the captive, to untie the bound and set free those who are in bondage. Not tomorrow, not in 3 months or 1 year, but now, today. His urgency to restore this woman cannot wait even until the Sabbath has passed. Some might say, she's waited 18 years. What's one more day? But Jesus says that no one should be denied the grace of God, not even for a day. And the same is true for you. God is offering that same healing, that same grace, that same restoration and salvation that made whole what was broken here and now. Now, does that mean that you can expect to walk out of here free from whatever has been ailing you? Maybe. All manner of things are possible through God. But more likely than not, today will be the beginning of your journey towards abundant life, just as it was for that woman. Because I have a real hard time believing that her life was nothing but sunshine and rainbows after this unexpected encounter with Jesus. I want there to be a 3-month follow-up interview like they do on House Hunters International so that we can see how she's been doing. Not to say that Jesus' cure didn't work. I'm sure that it was marvelous. But can you imagine how much her life must have changed as a result of this healing? I'm sure that it was incredible at first. I'm sure that she was in awe of all of the glorious new sights that she had to see, all the yoga that she could finally do. I'm sure that she marveled at the clouds, at the sunset on that first evening. I'm sure that a tear came to her eye when she saw the face of her daughter or her grandson for the first time without them having to stoop low into her field of vision. But I can also imagine that it must have been a little overwhelming as well, to take in that many new things, to observe life from such a different perspective. She had been bent over for 18 years. How many things did she have to relearn how to do? How many adjustments to her life did she have to make? Imagine going from staring at people's kneecaps for 18 years, and now suddenly you have to look them in the face and pay attention to facial cues and maintain eye contact, and all the while be responsible, for your own facial expressions as well. And how had this woman made a living? Was she a beggar? Would she have had to go find some means of supporting herself now? I say all of this not to put a damper on this miraculous story. I say it to remind us of the fact that this woman's healing didn't end that day in the synagogue. That's where it began. There would still be struggles and hardships, still be uphill battles that would need to be fought. But the wonderful thing about the healing that we receive from God, the bestowing of grace into our lives, is that it is not a once and for all kind of thing. It is a daily act. a sustaining act. It is an act that sets us free from that which has held us captive and that which will hold us captive again. Because there are so many snares out there in the world, so many burdens that need to be borne, so many hardships that will need to be endured. And God's grace is not an inoculation against those things, but rather the sustenance, the power to help us get through those things. And it is the promise of abundant life here and now. Abundant life that cannot be thwarted by obsolete rules and regulations, nor will it be delayed by the conditions or stipulations that we might place upon it. It is a gift that will find and heal and lift us up on a daily basis. So why wait for tomorrow when it can happen today? Amen.